Yeah, well, welcome everyone. My name is Oron Catts. I'm the director of Symbiotica at the University of Western Australia. So we are, I suppose, the first or one of the first artist-run wet biology laboratories in the world. And our interest is that of basically investigating the way in which life is now becoming both a raw material and a subject for artistic interest and manipulation. And it stems from the idea that as our knowledge of life is increasing and our ability of using living systems for many different ends is also increasing, there is a need for artists to engage with questions around life and our relationship to the very concept of life. And what we developed at Symbiotica is this very experiential, hands-on approach where artists are coming into the lab, where they can engage with life in its different levels and manifestations and manipulate it for many different kind of artistic outcomes and basically as a medium for artistic expression. So we have our own level 2 biological lab, but we also allow access to other experts and researchers like Kate over here, who act as mentors to the artist. And I think the reason for us meeting here today is really to have a conversation around the experience of Leora that came and did a residency at Symbiotica and developed a series of works that we'll be discussing here, as well as many other things. So maybe, Leora, you should introduce yourself and then we'll get the others to introduce themselves as well.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Leora Farber. I'm the director of a research center at University of Johannesburg called Visual Identities in Art and Design. And yes, I've been practicing as an artist for about 30 years with a very deep interest right over that period in the body. And so I didn't have the experience before of actually working with live matter. And so doing the residency in Perth with Symbiotica opened up quite a new kind of domain for me, where one can actually work with microbes, one can work with living matter. And yeah, the potential that I have discovered there has been enormous. It has had a great effect on my work. So yeah.
Kate?
Okay, so my name is Kate Hammer. I am a microbiologist. I do teaching and research at the University of Western Australia. And I had Leora in my lab. And I am like a pretty square scientist, really. I enjoy helping people to fulfill their vision, like whether it's a scientific vision or an artistic vision, as it may be. So I would like to think that I was of assistance to Leora to help her fulfill her creative visions within the lab over that summer.
Yeah, great. You're very humble because obviously you supported quite a few other artists and was a real great mentor and friend to Symbiotica and to the artistic community. So.
Yes, I know very little about the well, not pedagogy, but a lot of the theories and ideas behind the art. But I'd like to think that I'm quite good at making them happen via microbes. Like I know what the microbes will and won't do, so I can help with that part.
This is great.
But also very perceptive, Kate. I mean, sometimes you would look at my work and say, you know, what about trying this? What about trying that? And yeah, a kind of in tuneness with artistic processes at the same time as knowing the scientific side of it.
Thanks, Leora.
And Donna, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, yes. My name is Donna Franklin, and I've been working with fungi and bacteria for a number of years now. The catalyst was being an artist in residence and doing my master's at Symbiotica back in 2003, where I started to grow fungi into living garments. And for me, it's always about generating empathy for the non-human. That's crucial. But working with biological materials is basically everything. It's incredibly important for many reasons.
Danielle?
I'm just an external person in this panel, so I'm managing the galleries at ECU. So obviously I'm aware of the idea of bioart and have seen examples of this, but I've not worked in the field myself. So I'm excited to hear what you all have to say about it. Yeah, it's very exciting to meet you all.
Cool.
Thank you.
So Leora, maybe you can tell us a little bit more about especially this body of work, because what I find really fascinating with it is how multi-layered it is. You know,
Yes.
often there is a perception that artists working with biology are only engaging with just one kind of surface layer of this idea of, you know, engaging with life. But there's so many other layers in your work that I think we should kind of be aware of as we continue our conversation.
I think that's quite an interesting question, because as you say, Oron, I think a lot of artists are quite seduced by the medium. You know, it is seductive. I mean, it is unusual. It is, you know, sometimes very aesthetically pleasing. And there's this excitement about what can I do with live matter or matter as medium. But how do you take that further? You know, how does it just, you know, not just become something like paint or video? You know, the distinction between the medium and meaning. Now, that's not always clear, because matter also contains meaning. So, you know, there's a whole element around various kinds of theories that talk about how matter itself carries meaning, that the two are enmeshed together. For me, it was partially that, but it was also an opportunity to deal with concerns that I'd been dealing with in previous work, which was with the skins produced from kombucha. And I know, Donna, you've also done work in that area. And it is interesting because it was taking that body of work into the work in the lab, but keeping the same theoretical basis. So I was really looking at hauntology, sort of a sense of the lingering of colonialism, and by extension in South Africa, apartheid, and how these things surround us daily, the things we use every day. So a teacup, a dinner plate, a saucer has a kind of patterning that might have come from the Dutch or the English porcelain designs. But in fact, those designs actually came from China. So it was through, you know, the trade with the East that they went, you know, the Europeans went over and appropriated, they stole the Chinese designs, the blue and white designs, and both made it their own. And then a lot of that came to South Africa and probably colonies like Australia via slavery and via immigration from Europe to the colonies. And it just strikes me as fascinating that, yeah, in Australia, here, these legacies surround us. They're there everywhere. And people are not generally aware. You know, you sort of sip your tea out of a Royal Dalton or a fake Royal Dalton teacup, and there's a whole history that sits in that object and in the patterning of the object. So for me, that's a kind of theoretical base that I draw on quite strongly.
And I wonder if it's also linked to kind of the way in which human colonization also allowed the distribution of pathogens, for example, or other bugs. Exactly. And maybe Kate can kind of shed a little bit of light, is, especially in regard to the organisms that Leora was using in her work. You know, are they endemic to Australia? Are they been distributed by human kind of movements around the globe? What is kind of, I suppose what the question is, what is the agency of the human in facilitating kind of bacterial distribution and kind of diversity? Is that something that you thought about?
See, this is me being the square scientist. I just don't often think about things in this context. Microbes, I mean, we all know about humans and distributing microbes. I mean, technically viruses aren't microorganisms, but we all know that humans are very good at distributing viruses. Interestingly, most of the organisms that Leora worked with were what we would call environmental organisms. So from the soil or from water, because Leora wanted organisms that produced a color or a texture or something interesting. And to be honest, a lot of our human pathogens look pretty plain on agar. So we really kind of had to scour the ends of the earth to find interesting things that would make pigment. And so I would say that most of the organisms she used are probably quite widespread in the world, simply by a function of the fact that they live in soil, you know. So yeah. But you know, obviously humans have spread significant disease over time, not just in recent years. Historically, yes, we're really good at it.
As the COVID virus has just proved.
Demonstrated.
Yes, exactly.
Yes,
And obviously the way to control it is actually the kind of, I suppose, the biopolitics of controlling movements of human bodies across borders that are now, it becomes so significant, the idea of borders that we were hoping that we can live without is being reinforced by.
Yeah, it's science and medicine knocking heads with personal will and personal freedoms and that sort of individualistic attitude that people seem to have these days. Yeah.
Yeah, and this idea of kind of the agency and the relationship with other life forms, and this is something, Donna, that you mentioned about the empathy. So how do you generate this empathy when you're actually using those organisms for your own ends? As artists, you know, I suppose we all kind of facing this question that on the one hand, we want to see that there's kind of other life forms around the world that have their own right to exist without our interfering with them. But on the other hand, we're actually using them in our own work in different ways. So maybe, Donna, you can tell us a little bit about your kind of personal relationship with those life forms that you're working with.
Absolutely. So that's always the conundrum that you come across as a bioartist. And for me, I think it's a problem because you are manipulating these life forms, as you say, for, in my case, it was for the idea of making a garment. So it traps into elements of design and commodification of living things for our own purposes, which of course is really now taking off quite a lot. And for me, I find that still problematic. As an artist, as an art object, I hope that it encourages people to slow down and think and re-engage with these living things once they can see them in the gallery space. But for me, it's also about this manipulation is providing an alternative position on what usually happens with these microbes and fungi beyond sort of the limits that science has in terms of research outcomes and research questions, because you know scientists are in a lot of pressure to prove a particular point and come to a particular end point. But for the arts, we can always make it a little bit more profound or poetic. So I'm hoping that the objects have that in them, that currency in them as a cultural form of communication.
And how do you feel? And I think that would be a question both to you and to Leora, because your work, Donna, is now being quoted as like a seminal work in this whole new movement of working, especially with fungi, but also with other kind of organisms within kind of the fashion industry, with this strange, which can be seen as a form of greenwashing or biowashing or eco-washing of an industry which is actually responsible for quite a lot of damage in the world. So how do you feel about it? And then Leora, maybe you can kind of respond to that in regard to how your work and your choice of actually using those very domestic objects as a way of kind of conveying your message.
A lot of layers there.
Yeah.
I'm quite concerned because again we're thinking that the greenwashing and the technologies will save us from problems that really we've created. We've created a lot of monocultures, and this is why we're having so many issues now. So I think it's becoming a spectacle. It's becoming a bit celebratory. I'm not quite sure what the outcome will be, but again, I think we're using technology to find solutions to things that are actually quite straightforward, which is really just bringing biodiversity back instead of monocultures. So this idea of greenwashing and the use of garments and design and architecture, it does have potential, but we have to tread very carefully, I think, and think about this sensibly instead of getting sucked up by the hype of the whole thing. Yeah.
And Leora?
Okay, I'm going to go back a few steps in the conversation because I think my experience was quite different to yours, Donna, in relation to the materials, to the medium. I found that the thing that really threw me actually is I couldn't control the medium. I can't control the bacteria. I have lost autonomy as an artist. And that was a challenge. You know, at first I set out, I was going to, you know, I would paint the design in, and I imagined that the bacteria would follow the pattern, and I'd come the next day and there would be a perfect rose. Well, that was very far from the case. The bacteria has its own agency. It has its own life force. It does what it wants to do. So for me, it was about accepting that I'm not actually the author of this work. I'm not actually autonomous here. I'm not the maker. It's a collaboration between me and the bacteria, me and the medium. And it's an unscripted collaboration. In other words, I can try and control them. I can try and make a pattern in which they can grow. But they're going to do what they're going to do. And then I have to respond to that or don't. You know, so it's very much a sense of my losing control and being comfortable with losing control. And that's quite a mindset, you know, it's quite a different switch, because if you're, let's say you paint it, I mean, the paint doesn't have autonomy. It doesn't, you know, it doesn't contribute to the work. You're using the paint to create something that you can actually control. You can control how you want to use the paint, what it's going to do. But with the bacteria, it's a totally different story. And I mean, there were days when I walked in and I remember telling Kate once, oh, you know, those bacteria got so out of control, it looked like a bloodbath in here. And that's that unpredictability, that kind of like, okay, what am I going to walk in this morning and what did they do overnight? And then what am I going to do with them? So, and that for me created a very bodily sense of interaction with the media. In other words, that I kind of lost my autonomy and it became a kind of enmeshed or embodied experience with the material, with the microbes. And I think that's maybe a key, is that sense of loss of differentiation between self and other, really, is what we talk about there. Yeah.
And I think, I'm building on, sorry.
No, I would love to hear what Kate has to think about it, because obviously within the sciences, you try to reduce any variability in order for you to be able to control kind of your experiment to the nth degree. So how do you respond to this relationship with the bacteria, Kate?
With mirth, with hilarity. I don't know. I mean, I love microbiology. I love all of them. But, you know, working with Leora, with the microbes, I'd be like, oh, yes, that one will do that, but that one won't. So it was just a giant learning curve for both of us. And I do remember thinking at the start in my head, I was like, Leora thinks they're paint. She thinks that they're just going to stay where she puts them. And they don't. Yeah, and I remember like, okay, well, you know, I can say what I like, but really Leora has to figure this out for herself. And also it's her vision. I'm sort of just facilitating. So I could offer my experience and whatever I knew to try and like, you know, control different variables so that it would match Leora's vision and whatever she wanted to achieve. So I'm like, okay, we might be able to change the temperature or the medium or this, or hang on, leave it on the bench for a little bit, or all those sorts of things. But it was great to be able to use my technical experience from, you know, 20 plus years in a lab in a completely different way to help her achieve her vision. Yeah.
Basically dealing with two levels of unruliness, the artist and the bugs.
That's exactly the point, Oron.
Yeah. And also I think Leora, I mean, I don't know, but I think she had a very, very fast-tracked science education as well, because we really had to cover a lot of basic concepts just to be like, oh, no, that won't work because X, Y, Z. You know, so there was a lot of just
don't do this because it's going to be a biohazard.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. So we covered a lot of science at the same time.
Well, I learned an enormous amount in a very short time. The one thing that comes to mind here is the idea that I had to embrace failure. In other words, failure was sometimes a success. So when things didn't work the way I wanted it to, and the bacteria did their own thing, or the agar fell apart or whatever, instead of like normally, you know, as an artist, you know, you think, okay, that work is now failure, you know, I must chuck it out. To see that actually failure can be, it can work, you can make it work, but it's a different headspace. It's a way of looking at the work differently. So if the agar falls apart and makes fragments, well, that's actually quite good. So, you know, you've got very, very interesting fragments of a bowl. Whereas my first intention was, I want a perfect bowl. You know, I want a perfect cast. It must be beautiful. Until I realized that's impossible. It's actually impossible. So stop trying to achieve the impossible and embrace whatever happens.
Yeah.
No, because I think one thing, and this is where you can come in, Danielle, is what it means to present, what strategies galleries and museums are using in order to present this kind of work. And, you know, when you make the choice of including the living biological material within an exhibition, where you make other choices, and is it the same experience to see a video of the work or actually engage directly with the life form? Yeah.
Well, I can certainly speak to the experience had this year with Leora. So obviously when the application came through, the plan was that Leora would be in Perth to create new work and exhibit that in the gallery space as part of her exhibition. So obviously that couldn't happen. So we showed the video work instead. So I've not done an exhibition with this sort of art before. Obviously I've done many with video work. So yes, it was certainly interesting and a unique way of experiencing the work. I think as someone who hadn't experienced the physical work but only the video work, certainly made me feel as though I would really like to see the works themselves in physical form. The video was like a teaser trailer to me. Still very beautiful and a work in itself, but yes, made me, like, the tactility of the work in the video really makes you want to see it in the flesh. So yeah, I mean, it'd be interesting, Leora, to hear about how the experience with us and then the experience you're having now with this new show and the difference. Yeah,
exactly. Well, my initial idea, as Danielle has just said, was to actually come to Perth, make the objects, make the agar objects, and actually show those in a fridge in a gallery space. And obviously that presents quite a lot of challenges, but I thought, okay, I think I could, I can manage this. But then of course COVID happened and everything else happened, and so I was unable to come back to Perth. And so yes, the video became a way of extending the work, but it's not the same work. And I think that's the point that Danielle is making. It's not the same experience as looking at the physical object, and it's not actually the same work in a way. It's another work, it's a different thing. And it was quite a challenge to actually move from the physical object into the digital and realize I'm not just filming the physical object, I'm making a new work that's going to be perceived in a totally different way. And so I had to think around the principles of how the work was made. For example, using the bacteria, but how do I translate that into a visual filmic experience? What is the equivalence? What are the, without being documentary, I mean, it's easy. You can just film bacteria growing. That's really simple. And, that would be a kind of translation of the work. But I needed more than that. And so animation became a very interesting route to explore. So, and I worked with a really great editor. And together we looked at, well, what would be the patterns of growth if this bacteria was growing? What kinds of patterns would we pick out? Would it be a bubble that dropped down? Would it be a drip? Would it be a whole lot of patterning that moved across the surface? Obviously, these were just imaginative. I mean, they weren't how the bacteria actually grew. But it was extremely challenging. And then the presentation also becomes very important. And I think I achieved that a little bit better in the Cape Town show, the idea of being immersed in this space. I think in the ECU gallery, it was very much still videos playing on a wall. But with the Cape Town show, we had 4 very large scale videos. And even though it was a big room, you walked into this totally darkened room and it felt extremely immersive. You were immersed in different sounds, different images. One kind of became, how can I say, yeah, immersive is the word, and effective as well.
Kate, have you seen the videos? I wonder if you went through this kind of uncanny valley where you knew that those are the bugs that were growing in your lab, but somehow now they're being animated in different ways. Was there a kind of a sense that you're watching something new and different?
It's harder for me because I just see the biology of it. So I'm like, oh, I recognize that one. Or, oh, look at the, I literally think of species names and those sorts of things. But
when the animation kind of unfolded.
Yeah. I don't know. I think to me, I don't know. It's hard for me to explain. Because I love microbiology so much. I just get lost in whatever it happens to be, whether it's the physical objects or the animations, the videos, the immersive. I don't think about it the same way you guys do. I have my science perspective. Yeah.
Kate, I think something that was interesting for me was the idea of control. The lab is such a controlled space. And as you know, I had quite a lot of problems adapting to that, or it was a challenge really. So I think maybe your perspective comes from, you're doing controlled experiments. You're using something specific to determine a kind of outcome. You might not know the outcome, but you might have an idea of, if I do X and Y, maybe that will happen. Or you do tests to see if X and Y results in something or X and A results in something. So in a way it is exploratory. In a way it is, but it's in such a controlled manner. Yes, whereas mine was completely haphazard. I just do whatever and see what happens. Yeah.
But that's funny because galleries and museums are also highly controlled environments. And maybe Donna would like to share some of her experience of trying to travel with the fungi dress and showing it within those different contexts and some of the kind of, I suppose, challenges that you might have had showing, especially a fungi that is, if it's let loose, would consume the whole collection of a museum.
Yes, absolutely. So this always comes up, and I have to prepare months ahead for exhibitions to get the phytosanitary clearance, and I'm limited in the fact that the fungus must be contained, because, like you say, it will destroy paper, it will destroy paintings, it eats cellulose. So yes, it's always something that curators are concerned about, and it's always the first question is what happens when it gets out, which I love, that sort of unknown area that makes them a little edgy, a little nervous, because that's part of the point. I think also going back to your films as well, Leora, the way you approach those the abstract quality they have really opened up all sorts of other experiences around beyond the bacteria itself. It dealt with things like time and geology and other bodies, which was really quite beautiful. I just wanted to add that in there. But of course, with the film, documenting biological materials, sometimes that's the only outcome you will have, because these things are temporary. But in terms of negotiating and traveling with garments made out of fungus, going back to that again, I do have a couple. So I do have a couple of those. There's one overseas and there's one in Australia for that purpose as well.
How do you control them, Donna? I mean, are you able to stop the growth in some way or contain the growth in the dress?
It's to do with moisture, but I with the dress, I have it contained in a greenhouse type environment, so it does produce a lot of humidity. So there are moments where there is contamination, which can be problematic. When I was in Germany, we had some penicillin growing on the Pycnoporus, which of course is green and virulent and will grow very fast, not as fast as trichoderma, but it definitely was starting to take over. And the curator was a little concerned because it was not the one that was on the list. So we spent days trying to find some ethanol to knock it out. We couldn't find any, so we actually had to use vodka, but that worked. So I can't really control it, and it just does, like you say, it does what it wants to do. A few months later, because it was so humid in that environment, the curator called me up and said, "My gosh, your dress has had a baby," and it started producing an extra lump on it that had never happened before. And I thought that was the most fantastic thing ever. So, like you say, you embrace the unknown with these things, and that's the beauty. That's the challenging beauty of it. We never really had control. We shouldn't ever think we're superior.
Well, that's the point, you know.
That's
it's
the
not
point.
that we are superior. It's not that we have authority or autonomy over non-human, what's considered the non-human. And I think COVID again has proven that, you know, how we think we are infallible. We think we can take over nature. We think we can, you know, we are superior to other kinds of non-human entities. But actually, I mean, it has the ability to control us in very malicious or difficult ways. So it's not always a positive kind, you know. I've battled a lot with this idea of the malignancy of the COVID virus. And how do you come to terms with something that is your enemy? How do you know that they can kill you? This virus can kill you. And how do you learn to, in a way, live with that? That nature can be a powerful force that can actually take over humankind. Yeah.
I don't think it's being malignant. I think it's just doing what it does naturally.
Exactly.
It's just that we happen to be in the way. Well, we're the vessel, but you know, it's just doing what it does naturally.
We're the food that feeds it. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I suppose kind of this idea of both containing the dress, for example, in Donna's case, or choosing to go to present it via video, you lose a large, because the visual sense is not the only way you sense the existence of those other life forms. And when you go into Kate's lab, you actually can smell it. Yes, there's other senses that are playing a really important role in how we know that there's something there. And maybe you can kind of touch on that, and maybe Kate, you can tell us about kind of your maybe non-visual sensual experience with bugs.
Well, the smell is, I guess, the number one characteristic that you would notice. Some of them, I think, smell wonderful, or have, you know, very familiar smells. So I'm like, oh, this one smells great. You know, we're not supposed to smell them in a biosafety way. I do actually know a lab scientist that got sick from sniffing a culture, so you're not supposed to, but anyway. But some of them smell pretty bad. It's true. And the other thing I'm thinking is, from a video versus live perspective, is just being able to see the objects. I mean, hopefully you probably shouldn't be able to smell them because they'll be so well contained that you won't get smell, but you will see them and you will experience like glistening textures or matte textures or all of those things that I would think are less evident in a video. And I've also had this idea in my head because I remember a past student that we had, Tash, who worked with Candida. She would often mention this concept of disgust that people had. So I'm actually wondering whether the biological artists present have encountered that sort of repulsion and disgust as part of your artworks as well, or whether it's all just, wow, that's amazing, look what you've done. Do you care to comment on that?
This is a great question, and I think obviously I've been doing it for 25 years now, and when we just started, there was fear and disgust, and it's like this, this is kind of a line too far. We basically crossed the line just by even thinking about it. I actually remember speaking to a curator who said, "Why do you even bother spending time in the lab when you can paint those things?" Yeah, so a representation of them, because like this idea that your experience with life have to be mediated by so many different layers of representation, so not to be close to it. So the fear of life itself that seems to generate it. And obviously the bad rap that bacteria in particular have got. But now we have this really strange thing that bacteria is becoming our friend, with all of the conversations around the microbiome and this realization that, the probiotic kind of revolution, and suddenly the relationship is shifting. So yeah, I could see in the last 25 years a major shift, both the audience and the public, as well as kind of the galleries and museums, and kind of the general idea that actually life is being treated very, very differently than what it was even 25 years ago.